Towards the end of this week's parsha, we read a very interesting section, a very interesting part of the Torah. It gives us a long list of forbidden unions, who you're allowed to marry and who you're not allowed to marry, who you're allowed to consort with, and who it is forbidden to be with. And it's a very long list. And it's interesting that we actually read this on Yom Kippur, on the Yom Kippur Torah reading. It's this section, which is interesting. But it begins with an interesting preamble that I thought is worthy of investigation. It tells us, this is chapter 18 of the book of Leviticus, K'maaseh eretz Mitzrayim asher yashavtem bam lo ta'asu. As the deeds of the land of Egypt in which you dwelled, do not do. Meaning, don't copy the Egyptians. Don't emulate the Egyptians. The Egyptians behaved in one way. The Egyptians, your former neighbors, they behaved in one way. Don't copy them. Uk'maaseh eretz Canaan asher nevi eschem shama lo ta'asu. And like the deeds of the Canaanites. Now, the Jewish people are now between Egypt and Canaan. They have departed from Egypt. They haven't quite arrived in Canaan. They're in between these two nations, these two peoples. And the Almighty is telling the Jewish people, like the behavior of the Egyptians, those people that you just departed from, and like the behavior of the Canaanites, the people to whom you are going to settle down, don't do what they do. Don't emulate their ways. Don't go in their chukim. Don't follow their statutes. Don't copy them. Don't mimic them. Don't behave as they do. Instead, the Almighty tells the Jewish people, "Es mishpatai tasu, my laws you should follow. Ves chukosai tishmora, my statutes you should guard. You should go in their ways. I am Hashem, your God." And then verse 5 of chapter 18, Ushmartem es chukosai ve'es mishpatai she'ya'aseh osam adam v'chai bahem, ani Hashem. You should guard my statutes and my laws, that when a person does it, they shall be given life. I am Hashem. So we have an introduction to the laws of the prohibited unions and relationships, and it tells us that these behaviors are the hallmarks of the people that you just left, people you just departed from, the Egyptians, and the people to whom you're about to join, namely the Canaanites. This is how they behaved, but you should not copy them. You should not behave as they do. Instead, you should follow the ways of Hashem, your God. Now, towards the end of the parsha, it tells us what is going to happen in the event that the Jewish people, in fact, do mimic the Canaanites. Suppose you violate the Torah and you say, "Oh, I'm not listening, and I'm going to do all these things that the Canaanites did." So God warns them that you will suffer the same fate as the Canaanites. The Canaanites are about to be bounced from the land. The land is about to disgorge the Canaanites. Why? Because they're behaving in a way that's not compatible with the land. And if you emulate the ways of the Canaanites, you too will be disgorged, expelled from the land, because the land is not tolerant of this sort of behavior. So we have the kind of the beginning of this section, the introduction to the section, where they're told, "Oh, the Egyptians behave like this, the Egyptians that you just left, and the Canaanites behave like this, the Canaanites they're about to displace from the land. And you don't do this. Instead, follow the ways of God and don't do all these unions one after another." It lists, dozens of different relationships that are prohibited. And then it ends off with a warning: in the event that you do engage in this sort of behavior, you will suffer the same fate as the Canaanites. You will be kicked out of the land as they were. Now, it is very interesting that we're told that this forbidden behavior, these are the ways of the Egyptians and the ways of the Canaanites. In most laws of the Torah, We're told this is what you do, this is what you don't do. We're given what is the required behavior, what is the forbidden behavior. And we're not given like the explanation. Oh, this is how the French behave, and this is how the Italians behave, and don't behave like the Nigerians or the Mexicans or the Mongolians or the Australians. That's not what it says. It just gives us the law, the practice. This is the code of conduct that Hashem is instructing us, that He's commanding us with. And this is what He wants us to do. This is what He wants us to withhold from doing. In this particular section, we have this very unusual introduction where God says, oh, what I'm about to tell you, this is like the practices, the behavior of the Egyptians, the people that you just recently departed from. And it's also the practices of the Canaanites, the people that you're about to encounter on the other side of the Jordan. So that's just an unusual feature of this subject. And the question is why? Like, well, why are we giving this introduction? So Rashi, of course, addresses this. And he says something fascinating. He says that from all the nations, we know, going back to the beginning of the Torah, there are 70 different nations, and then there's the Jewish nation, that's like the 71st nation. Of all the nations, Rashi tells us, the two worst are the Egyptians and the Canaanites. These two are the absolute worst of all the nations. And specifically, the Egyptians that were the immediate neighbors of the Jewish people, those who were in close proximity to the nation, those were the worst of the Egyptians. So the Egyptians, they were the worst. And even amongst the Egyptians, the worst of the worst were the Jewish neighbors. Similarly, in the land of Canaan, which is the other nation that we're going to spend some time with, the Canaanites were also the worst of the worst. So, of course, raises the question, why do we always have such terrible neighbors? Why, when we're going to exile in Egypt, is it going to be amongst the absolute lowest spiritual people? And when we actually arrive at the promised land, we arrive in the land of Canaan, we have to deal with the Canaanites, and they are likewise the worst of the worst. It's also interesting. We know the Jewish people in Egypt, they settled in a place called Goshen. That was the part of Egypt that they selected. They told Pharaoh, we want to live in the land of Goshen. Implied from this Rashi, when Rashi tells us that even in Egypt, the worst of the Egyptians were the ones who lived in close proximity to the Jews, it's implied that the worst sin city of sin country of Egypt, that was Goshen. And that's specifically where the Jews said, this is where we want to live. You would imagine, if you had to live in a terrible place, you'd find, at least the least bad of the neighbors. It's almost as if, again, just working through what we know from Rashi here, it's almost as if the Jewish people specifically chose to have not just bad neighbors, but the worst neighbors. And that's an idea that needs to be pondered. I did read about this particular question. When you have neighbors, they're going to influence you. And if you're going to have bad neighbors, they may influence you badly. But if you have the worst neighbors in the world, people that are absolute dregs of society, the lowest of the low, then you're going to feel a little bit of a distance from them, and you're not going to learn anything from them. If you have neighbors that appear to be righteous, and there's some sort of redeeming quality about them, you may say, you know what, I'll take the bad with the good. You'll tolerate more from them. So counterintuitively, it might be the best neighbors are actually the worst people in the world, because those people will not influence you. Just an idea. But there's a question over here. We're told you've had bad neighbors. You're leaving. Egypt. You're leaving the part of Egypt that at the worst of the worst. You're going to Canaan, where really bad people do what is against the will of Hashem, where they live. Don't emulate these nations. What about other nations? This verse could perhaps be misunderstood as saying that there are two nations that we must not emulate. But everyone else, it's fair game. Could we emulate the Romans, the Babylonians, the Persians, the Assyrians, the Greeks, the Byzantines, the Americans? God bless them. The verse is saying, well, the Egyptians, don't copy them. The Canaanites, don't copy them. Well, if these are the only two nations that I ought not to copy, it's implied from that, well, other nations we perhaps may copy, may mimic, may emulate, may follow in their ways. And that is that in fact true? You wouldn't think so. We shouldn't do any bad behavior. We shouldn't copy any bad nations. You imagine. This is the question of the Maharal. It's an unusual feature of our parsha. The Torah gives us a list of mitzvos. Great, that's very common. But then it defines, this is the behavior of the Egyptians, and this is the behavior of the Canaanites, and don't copy them. And don't do what they do. But wait, am I supposed to copy other nations? Of course not. So why are these nations and their behavior specifically singled out as nations that we ought not to emulate? And what he says in his answer, it's a fascinating idea. Of course, if there's a bad person, you go the opposite direction. Woe to the wicked and woe to their neighbor, the Talmud tells us. Because the neighbor's going to learn from the behavior of their neighbor and may come to copy it. And the bad behavior will rub off on the ostensibly good person, and they'll become corrupted. And that's true on an individual level, communal level. Make sure you have you live in an environment where there are good people to influence you. And it's certainly true on a national level. If you were to ask the Torah, you were to ask Moshe, wait, Moshe, are we supposed to emulate the behavior of, I don't know, the Lebanese or the Russians? He would say, no, you follow the Torah 100%. That's what you're supposed to do. Nevertheless, there's something specifically nefarious about these two nations. The Egyptians and the Canaanites are corrupt in a very specific sort of way. And what they represent, what they embody, it's the complete direct antithesis of what we stand for as a nation. So yes, of course, there's a lot of things that we do. And we have all sorts of behaviors that are not compatible with the behaviors of all the nations. But there are two nations who are so corrupt in a way that if we were to follow them, we're losing our essence. Not just our practices, our behaviors, but who we are, what we stand for. And therefore, you could be a sinner and be a Jew, Maharal says. But if you copy the Canaanites and the Egyptians, you're done. You're done. Your identity, your standing as a Jew is over. Why? Because what does it mean to be a Jew? What's Moshe telling them? When Moshe is saying, don't copy their ways, he's telling us that all these laws, all these unions, all these relationships, all these people that you could marry, you could consort with, and those that you cannot, the sexual integrity that the Torah is defining for us, that is what makes us a nation. That is our essence. Our essence is about being careful in these matters. And therefore, the two nations that are completely antithetical to us are the ones who are flagrant in their violation of these laws. And yes, we don't copy any nation that does anything wrong. But these two in particular, they are completely incompatible with us, because who are we? What do we stand for? Integrity in these matters, being upstanding in these matters. That's who we are. That's our identity. That's our definition. And therefore, these two in particular are singled out, because what they do stands in direct and irreconcilable opposition to what we stand for as a nation. That's what the Maharal says. And then he adds another point, which is kind of a mind-bending idea. Why did God do the Exodus? And why do we have to displace the Canaanites? The Exodus, of course, we think of it as taking us out of Egypt. Says the Maharal, we had to be removed from Egypt because we cannot be in close proximity to the Egyptians. There was an incompatibility, not with us and Egypt, but us and the Egyptians, because what we stand for and what they stand for are exact opposites. And for that same reason, the Canaanites have to be displaced, because they are a repudiation of what our national essence and identity is. Our essence and their essence conflict irreconcilably. And if someone were to, God forbid, adopt their ways and behave k'ma'asei Eretz Mitzrayim, as the deeds, the behavior of the Egyptians and the Canaanites, they are in effect forfeiting and repudiating their standing as a Jew. That is what the Maharal says. And that's why we have this very unusual introduction to these verses in our Parsha, because there's something very Jewish about this. This is who we are. This is what we stand for. And other nations, we cannot copy them, because that is losing our identity and essence as a Jew. That's what the Maharal says. And the question I wanted to ponder is why? I understand what the Maharal is saying. He's saying that there are practices and there are ideals and there are values and there are priorities that define us. Not just practices that we do, but this is who we are. And the Egyptians and the Canaanites, well, they're antithetical to that. But why? Why is this our most central, defining characteristic? That's a question that the Maharal does not address. And I wanted to maybe take a stab at it. It is certainly not a coincidence that the very first mitzvah in the Torah, the very first commandment that humanity is ever given, is to be fruitful and to multiply, is to bear children. That's not a coincidence. The very first thing that we're told, us as a species and us as those who were studying the Torah, the very first thing we're told is to bear children. If that is the first mitzvah, it must have a central role in what we're supposed to do, or what we're supposed to accomplish. And again, like we mentioned earlier, this Torah session is read on Yom Kippur. On Yom Kippur, on that day that we're trying to make sure that our life is we're living in a way that's aligned with what our ideals really ought to be. where we examine our behavior, examine our life trajectory, examine our deeds, examine our choices, and say, are we actually living up to what is expected of us? That's the sort of questions we ask on Yom Kippur. And what do we read about? This section. Did you behave like the Egyptians? Did you behave like the Canaanites? Did you do all these, well, God forbid, are you living up to this incredible responsibility of being part of this nation? So if we read this Yom Kippur, and this is the first mitzvah, there must be something about choosing a spouse in a way that is aligned with the values of the Torah. There must be something about that that is very central. So I want to speculate like this, a few different ideas. We're told that there's some sort of similarity between the human and God. Man is created b'tselem Elokim, in the image of God. What does that mean? I don't know. But it means something to the effect that there's some sort of overlap. In some way, b'tselem, tselem is from the word tsel, which means a shadow. There's some sort of similarity between the thing and the thing's shadow. It resembles it in some way. Its shape maybe in some way that is similar. We're b'tselem Elokim. We're in the image of God. Well, what do we know about God? God is the creator. And the creation of God is really the creation of the human, because everything else, it's all the arena in which the human plays, right? The purpose of all creation is fulfilled with the creation of humanity. Everything else was just setting the stage. So if God is the creator of humans, and in humanity's highest form, humanity can be in the image of God, can also create something which is eternal. Well, a human can create another human. Of course, with some assists from God, as we know. But a human can create a human. God is the creator of what? Of humanity. And who could do that as well? We can. It's such an astonishing insight. We have the ability to summon a soul from heaven to create a human. That's like a mind-bending idea. And I know it's obvious, everyone knows that. But if you think about it in this context, like the Talmud, for example, tells us that there are three partners in every person: Father, Mother, and God. How's that for a law firm? Father, Mother, and God? What? You're a partner with God in creating a human? That's a mind-bending idea. You could do something on the same level, so to speak, of course, as it were. You and God are partners in this endeavor. You're acting in some way in a godly fashion. That's crazy. But of course, we know that this is within the capacity of humanity. Our greatest strength, our greatest ability is to somehow be godlike in our lives. So of course, the whole Torah is telling us, God's instructing us how to live in a more godly fashion. We're told, "V'halachta b'derachav," emulate God. Whatever God does, you should try to do the same. The very first mitzvah tells us, instructs us to marshal, to deploy the power that we have to be in the image of God, to use it, to be fruitful and multiply. Use it in a constructive manner. In a constructive manner rather than in a destructive manner. Is it a coincidence that the epicenter of a man's battle with the Yetzer Hara is in this area? Is that just a coincidence? Now, again, it used to be that we had a Yetzer Hara for idolatry, and that, even though it's a similar sort of impulse, but it's a very different, at least from our understanding, it's different desire, and it's a different subject. Even though, again, the Talmud does compare the two. But today, the epicenter of a man's challenge is here. Why? Because this is where it's determined whether or not you're living up to your ideals or to the potential that you had. The potential you had to be a creator of humanity. In this ability, we have the most capacity to be like God. And therefore, in this area is where we can achieve the greatest of our accomplishments, and that's why it's going to be targeted. The Yetzer wants us, he attached strength. This is our strength. He wants to neutralize, he wants to weaken it, he wants to ruin it. We have a superpower. It's the first mitzvah, and it's corruptible. And if we corrupt it, we're in big trouble, because that's what our nation is here to do. What is our nation doing here? Like, well, what's the essence of our nation? To behave not like the Egyptians, not like the Canaanites. This is what we are. Our essence is that we want to be like God. We want to be creators of humanity. What's the second mitzvah in the Torah? The second mitzvah is featured in chapter 17 of Genesis, and that is the mitzvah of circumcision. Well, what's circumcision? Circumcision is the mitzvah about demonstrating the existence and dominion of God in this same arena. This arena of your capacity for eternal, transcendental greatness. Make sure that it's God who's in charge, not the Yetzer Hara, not the false God. To me, this was a very radical insight. What I was telling us, we could find an example of many different types of people who violate the laws of the Torah. Probably with every single mitzvah, we could find some example of someone who behaves in a way that's opposed to that mitzvah. But only in one area are we told not to behave like those people. Don't copy these people. Instead, follow the Torah. We're going to read about not taking revenge. You don't think we can find some example of some people or some nation that embodies revenge taking more than anyone else? Non-kosher. You don't think we can find a nation that typifies eating non-kosher? Should say, well, don't copy them. In only one area are we told don't copy these other nations, because this is what we stand for as our nation. Our nation, our mission statement is to deploy our superpower in a constructive and godly manner. To me, that was a very powerful insight. And when you look at the sources, you find some very frightening statements. Very frightening statements. When we think of the hierarchy of mitzvos, we don't usually think about procreation as a very high, important mitzvah. It's almost like an afterthought. You're so caught up in the beginning of Genesis, and it's so complicated, and it's so above your head. We miss it. The Talmud tells us and I'll just read you what the Talmud says, and it's going to be very harsh. It is very harsh. Whoever does not fulfill the mitzvah of, or let me be precise, whoever does not engage in procreation. It doesn't say whoever does not procreate, because some people, of course, they cannot procreate. They're infertile. And maybe there are different dimensions of procreation, because the Talmud, for example, says if you teach someone Torah, it's like you gave birth to them, which means like you're spiritually bringing a life to the world, even though it's not in the more traditional sense of the word. But if someone does not engage at all in procreation, Ki'ilu shofech damim. The Talmud, I'll give you the Talmud citation. Don't shoot the messenger. Don't blame me. It says, the book of Yevamos on page 63b. If someone does not engage in procreation, they're like a murderer. We think of, I think justly, of murder as the worst of the worst. And here we're told someone doesn't engage in procreation, they're like a murderer. That is very, very harsh. Now, you could rationalize it and say, well, suppose someone could engage in procreation and they withhold from it. Well, had they engaged in procreation, there would be another human. And now that they refrained from procreation, well, there is no human. And therefore, it's then if you just calculate it, if there was a human and you killed that human, or there could have been a human and you prevented that human from coming, it's the same amount of people. So it's akin on that level. But I think that on a more basic level, this is trying to impress upon us how serious and how important and how central this is to what Hashem wants of us. Now, the Talmud continues and says a second opinion. The second opinion says, if someone does not engage in procreation, they're like reducing the image of God. Now, I don't even know what that means. What does it mean to reduce the image of God? And I'm just translating because the words are not in English in the original Talmud. The Talmud says, ki'ilu, as if, mema'it, they're diminishing, they're reducing. Hadmus, the dmus means like the image. And it quotes the verse, B'Tselem Elokim asas Adam, God made humanity in his image. And this is the second time that that's mentioned, which is in Genesis chapter 9. And afterwards it says, you shall procreate. So by the juxtaposition of these two verses, we learn that there's some sort of diminishing of the image of God in the world by lack of procreation. And the third opinion is the harshest of them all, and that is the one that states that when someone does not procreate, does not engage in procreation, they are both like a murderer and like someone who reduces or diminishes the image of God in the world. When we read that in the Talmud, we certainly appreciate just how central this mitzvah is. And I think now we understand why. If this mitzvah is what defines us as a people, this is what we're here to do. This is the first mitzvah of the Torah, second mitzvah of the Torah. This is to do this properly and not corrupt it like the Egyptians or like the Canaanites. That is who we are. That's what we stand for. That's what it's all about. And this mitzvah, we can truly partner with God more than any other mitzvah. You're the Father, the Mother, and God. That's the three partners in a person. I think it does make a bit more sense in that context. So for us, this is like a sticky subject. See why they don't make this into a podcast, right? I don't know what I would have done if I had more time to talk about it on the podcast. But I think this is like an important lesson. It's an important subject. I don't think we discuss it enough. And I don't know, I don't know of a way to bring up to broach this subject on the podcast in a way that's not going to elicit a lot of harsh reactions from the audience. But I think it's a very powerful insight what the Maharal is saying. Of all the mitzvos that most embody our nation and our essence, it's this. It's this. It's finding a spouse and a mate that's proper. And thus, of all the mitzvos, the one time where the the opposite is singled out, it's over here. And yeah, that's what I wanted to share with y'all tonight.